Xi Jinping has taken up a new assignment, and there's only one way to describe it: mission impossible. The Chinese president is in Moscow. He's holding talks with Vladimir Putin. Beijing describes it as a voyage of friendship. But make no mistake, this visit is about the war in Ukraine. Xi Jinping wants to play mediator. The rest of the world is not so sure about that. The West, for instance, may not accept a deal brokered by China. But Putin takes Xi Jinping quite seriously. The Russian president called the Chinese leader his best friend. He's welcomed Chinese mediation. In fact, let me quote from what Putin said before Xi's arrival. "We welcome China's willingness to play a constructive role." And what about Xi Jinping? What does he think? The Chinese president appears to share the sentiment, and his support for Russia remains steady. Xi Jinping set the tone before his arrival in Beijing. The Russian media published an article. It was signed by the Chinese president. Let me give you the highlights. Xi Jinping wants to focus on three things: enhance coordination and planning, create favorable conditions for investment, and step up people-to-people ties. There's also a mention of the war in Ukraine. Let me quote from what was said there. "I have put forth several proposals, that is, observing the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respect of the legitimate security concerns of all countries, supporting all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis, and ensuring the stability of global industrial and supply chains." Those were Xi Jinping's words. And how would he like to mediate in the war? There are some clues in the article. President Xi says the West should not be driving this negotiation. Instead, the process should be led by the United Nations Security Council. Remember, both China and Russia have the veto power at the United Nations Security Council. The question is, what does China stand to gain by this? Two things: boost its stature in global affairs and limit the role of the West. The idea is to challenge and, if possible, upend a world order dominated by the US. And this is Xi Jinping's biggest draw and the reason why he wants to get his hands dirty in the Ukraine conflict. Russia has welcomed this, and Russia has its own reasons to welcome China's involvement. With China at its side, Russia is not isolated, and Putin also gets to keep his gains in Ukraine. If he pulls it off, it will be a setback for the West and, of course, for Ukraine. Earlier today, the Kremlin issued a statement. It said the two leaders will discuss Chinese proposals to, quote-unquote, halt the Ukraine conflict. So that's very much part of their plan. We'll have to see where this will go. The timing of this visit is also significant. Look at the events in the past few days. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant against Putin. It doesn't mean very much, but it's a political statement nonetheless. In defiance, Putin went to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol. This is a city in the Donetsk region. Russia has occupied it. Putin's visit was a show of strength. He went by a helicopter, then he drove around in a car. The Russian president was seen taking a tour of various districts. He even met with locals and visited a flat.
Это все покупали, все голые стены.
Ну что? И сколько здесь комнат у вас?
Три.
Всего хорошего. До свидания. Спасибо большое. Всего хорошего. До свидания. До свидания.
Russian forces took Mariupol almost a year ago. So why did Putin visit now? To show that he's in control. Like I said, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant against him. He's been charged with war crimes. The ICC is known as the court of the last resort for the world's worst crimes. When no one can persecute suspects, the ICC steps in, or so they say. But it can take no meaningful action against Putin. Neither Russia nor the United States is party to the ICC. A Russian leader has compared the warrant to toilet paper. China too has stepped in to give diplomatic cover to Putin.
The International Criminal Court should uphold an objective and impartial stance, respect the immunity of heads of state from jurisdiction under international law, exercise its functions and powers with circumspection in accordance with the law, interpret and apply international law in good faith, and avoid politicization and double standards.
Putin's Mariupol visit underscored how powerless the ICC is. And the West knows it. It is doubling down to arm Ukraine. Europe wants to spend over $1 billion to provide ammunition for Ukraine. They will buy over 1 million rounds of artillery to be sent to Kiev. And that may be the single biggest challenge to any peace plan. When you keep pumping weapons and money into a war, how do you expect to stop it? Now to the banking crisis that we've been tracking. It was a busy weekend for the Swiss government. There were crisis talks and hastily negotiated deals. They saved a bank by having it sold. We're talking about Credit Suisse. It was on the brink of collapse. We told you about it last week. Credit Suisse got a bailout from the Swiss central bank. But the bailout could not save the bank. It is now being sold. And it's being bought by its rival called UBS. UBS is Switzerland's largest banking group. The deal was brokered by the Swiss government. It's being called historic.
This solution is the takeover of Credit Suisse by UBS. It is supported by the Federal Council, following several meetings with the Swiss National Bank, with our regulator, the FINMA, with Credit Suisse and UBS. And the Federal Council welcomes this takeover and is supporting it by guaranteeing the framework conditions necessary for its success.
Investors too have welcomed the deal. It was the final episode in the stunning fall of Credit Suisse, the 166-year-old financial institution. Its downfall has been years in the making. It suffered a string of scandals, shake-ups in the management, and failed attempts at reform. The upheaval in the global financial market sealed the bank's fate. It exposed the vulnerabilities of Credit Suisse. Like I said, the bank was sold to its rival UBS. The market value of Credit Suisse was $8 billion on Friday, but it was sold for less than half of this value. UBS will pay just $3.3 billion for this bank. And the Swiss Reserve Bank will lend more than $100 billion, and this is being done to ensure liquidity. But why was the merger necessary? Because Switzerland was worried that the bank could go under.
The bankruptcy of a global systematically important bank would have caused irreparable economic turmoil in Switzerland and throughout the world. For this reason, Switzerland had to take the responsibilities beyond its own borders.
It is not an ideal situation, but Switzerland had to swallow the bitter pill. You see, Credit Suisse was not just a bank, it was an institution. It was part of the Swiss identity, a name synonymous with Swiss banking.
Der Bundesrat bedauert.
The Swiss government regrets the fact that CS was not in a position to master the difficulties on its own. That would have been the best solution. We regret this not least because many thousands of employees are affected.
Weil viele tausende Angestellte betroffen sind.
So what happens next? Job cuts are inevitable. At least 9,000 jobs at Credit Suisse could be slashed. And this could just be the beginning. Remember, UBS and Credit Suisse were competitors. Now they will work as a single entity, so some departments will become redundant. Europe is still grappling with the fallout of this. Meanwhile, in America, where the crisis began, the situation is precarious. The markets are still in panic. Some tough calls are being taken. The assets of Signature Bank, for instance, are being sold. This is one of the two banks which failed earlier this month. Signature Bank is in New York. Its deposits and loans are being sold. The buyer is a subsidiary of New York Community Bank Corp. This too is a bank headquartered in New York. Plus, there is another ticking time bomb. It's called First Republic. It's a bank in distress. Last week, 11 major banks stepped up to save First Republic. They decided to infuse $30 billion, $30 billion. But it seems the bank could not be saved. The plan may not have worked. Credit ratings agency S&P has downgraded the bank further. It now rates First Republic as B+. That basically means junk. Connect the dots and you'll see a pattern. Banks are on shaky ground. Governments and regulators have now stepped in to save them. They're failing to stem the losses and revive sentiment. The impact will be felt across the globe. The world's biggest central banks are trying to avert an explosion. They're turning on the taps and pushing more dollars into the market. 6 central banks are working in tandem. Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Bank of Canada, European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, which is America's central bank, and the Swiss National Bank. They issued a joint statement, and here it is on the screen. What does it say? Why are these central banks doing this? According to them, pumping more dollars will, quote-unquote, ease strains in the global funding markets. But there's no guarantee that these measures will work. Meanwhile, in the US, the blame game has begun. Who triggered this crisis, the banks or the regulator? A US lawmaker is blaming the Federal Reserve. Her name is Elizabeth Warren. She says the chairman of the US Fed failed. Now, Warren is a Democrat, and she wants an inquiry into the bank collapse.
I'm calling for an independent investigation of the Fed. We got to take a close look at this. And look, we got to say overall that we can't keep repeating this approach of weakening the regulation over the banks, then stepping in when these giant banks get into trouble.
She's right. It is an honest and rare admission. The failure of American banks exposed the missteps of American regulators. The Fed's aggressive rate cuts dried up cash in the banking system. That's one of the reasons why these banks failed. Now the losses are mounting. This story is far from over.